Our guests today certainly don't need an introduction. Meredith Cross is a partner at WilmerHale, now living in Connecticut. She used to serve as the director of the Division of Corporation Finance. Keith Higgins also served as a director of the Division of Corporation Finance and recently retired as the partner of Ropes and Gray in Boston. And Alan Dye served as special counsel for Chair Shad at the SEC way back in the day. He's a partner of Hogan Lovells, a Section 16 expert, but knows a whole lot more than that. He's in Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about disclosures, hot topics, hot takes. I'm Brock Romanek today on Zippy Point. Well, we've got our all-star panel here. I'm so grateful to Meredith, Keith, and Alan for doing this. We're going to get right into it, hot topics for disclosure. So the first topic, Meredith, is human capital disclosure. It's obviously in the news because of what the SEC has done, but also this is because this is what investors, what shareholders are talking about. So what are your practice tips in this area?
Well, I guess I'd start off by saying that people are struggling with what they're supposed to be putting in their 10Ks now that the SEC has a reference to human capital resources in the business description. And so there's so many surveys getting put together based on early filings of 10Ks. I would not obsess over the surveys. I would think about the disclosure requirement in light of its goal, which is a principles-based, open-ended talk about what's material for you on human capital resources. The principles-based approach was very controversial. It caused two of the commissioners, the two Democratic commissioners, to vote against the SK modernization. And as you can imagine, now that the Democrats are going to be in charge, this will be a hot topic for them to be thinking about. So this is a very much of a watch this space, also consistent with your point, Brock. This is something that people are just really laser focused on. I would say my practice pointers on this one are make an effort to enhance your disclosures. There are some that you can see in the surveys that are saying how many employees they have, exactly like last year. And that's gonna stand out as you didn't try, you don't care. It may be that you just missed it, the new requirement, but it is a good idea to take a look at the new requirement and think about something to improve your disclosures there. One thing that's happening in some filings is people are cross-referencing to things that are not in their filing stream, like their reports on their website about sustainability and things like that. And while you'll get credit with your stakeholders for that information being out there, it doesn't count for responding to the requirement to disclose the material factors about human capital resources. So, and frankly, I think people may view that as an effort to avoid taking responsibility for the disclosure under the 34. I think if you think the information is important, consider putting it in the filing. If it's just useful information elsewhere in the document, you might want to cross-reference to that for information, but I would not do it when you're talking in response to that particular item. And then one sort of daunting point, but I think is likely, and I imagine that Keith and Alan would agree, is that because this is such a controversial point, that they put this as an open-ended principles-based disclosure requirement without detailed requirements. And Commissioners Lee and Crenshaw both said that they don't think that works. I think there will be some sort of, I haven't heard this, I have no inside knowledge, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of review effort made in Corp Ben to see if in fact a principles-based open-ended disclosure requirement like this is resulting in meaningful disclosure improvements, or if not, then that would provide additional ammunition for them to go to a more rules-based requirement. So that's my lead off.
Hey, Meredith, let me say I totally agree with all those. I also think it's going to be tricky because of the stakeholders involved in the disclosure, or who your disclosure is directed to. It's not only investors, you've got your employee base, you've got customers, you've got your community, you've got activist groups, et cetera, who are going to be interested in this disclosure. My working assumption is that if you put it in your CSR report that you have on your website, I wouldn't be too worried about just bringing it in wholesale into the 10K. Obviously think about liability issues and your ability to pin this information down in the same kind of way you would in your 10K. But I think you're gonna, if you have different messages in different documents, I think you risk raising questions about the disclosure. The other thing I'd like to actually get Meredith and Alan's view on is, how are you going to deal? Most of this disclosure to date has been in the proxy statement. Now it's going to be in the 10K, which comes out a month or so before the proxy statement. What are you going to say in the proxy statement about human capital? Is it just going to be how the board is involved in it, or will there be a repeat of the metrics, or what?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts that I'd like to get across quick. On the putting the whole thing in wholesale, I think that makes sense from a stakeholder relations standpoint. It is essentially ramping it up to a materiality level, and a number of issuers are not interested in taking the position that information is material. Well,
do you think putting it in absolutely, confirms that it's material? You're allowed to put immaterial information, as companies have done for years in their filings.
I agree. You can take that position.
Yeah.
I think this is something that people are gonna struggle with. And then it's a good segue, so to whatever it is Alan wants to add, but it's a good segue to your next point about D&I disclosures, because I do think of this as proxy statement information, and it's an area of on shareholder proposals and everything else is your very, very hot topic. But Alan, I defer to you.
Well, sure, I agree. I think that is a good segue to Keith's section on diversity and inclusion. So maybe I'll make some remarks now in response to what you said, Meredith, and spare Keith having to listen to me make a similar point about D&I disclosure. My thought is that the new disclosure requirement is essentially what you said, Meredith. It's materiality based. It's not prescriptive. And the materiality standard is material to the business of the company as a whole. I'm hard pressed to say how much disclosure about human capital management is really material to the company as a whole. So I think it will be easy for companies to reach a conclusion on a lot of these issues that it doesn't really need to be disclosed in the 10K. And we're disclosing what we want, as Keith referred to them as stakeholders, to know in a sustainability report or on our website or in some other fashion. So my thought is that it isn't necessary for the company to put the disclosure on the website and then also put it in the 10K and then also put it in the proxy statement, which is where a condensed form of that disclosure often appears, but to make sure that whoever's doing the drafting is reviewing all of those disclosures so that everything is in sync, it's seamless, information is consistent from one place to the next. And companies can reach their own conclusions about how to balance that disclosure, whether to have it be duplicative or to put some disclosure in one place and some place in the others. But I do think we're going to see some level of disclosure in all three places. I'm just not sure that all of it will be in the 10K.
One interesting point that's similar to what was said back in the beginning of the cybersecurity disclosure topics. They have the focus on if it's different in a segment, you need to talk about it. And I imagine that would be really complicated from a HR employee relations standpoint. You're going to have some segments where it's really hard to get people and you have to do all sorts of things to retain them and the like. In other segments, not so much. And you're not going to want it to sound like you only care about some of the segments versus others. I don't know how people are going to balance that because that is specifically in the disclosure requirements. So that's a little bit sensitive, I think.
Keith, do you want to talk about D&I a little bit?
Love to talk about D&I. So diversity and inclusion, this is an area where what's happening out in the marketplace has so far eclipsed what the SEC disclosure standards are that it's not even close. And even in diversity and inclusion, you see many people talking now about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a topic that particularly over the last year has grown immensely in importance and focus, and companies are going to be looking at what to do on the disclosure front. The SEC disclosure requirements are pretty minimal, just on how the board considers diversity in choosing candidates. We've gone beyond that. Most companies are putting in some sort of disclosure around the diversity, at least on an aggregate basis, of their board of directors, based on race, national origin, gender, ethnicity, sometimes sexual preference. And that, I think that's actually going pretty well as far as private ordering goes. I think you'll see increasingly a push for more information like that about the executive team, the executive officers. And certainly on the shareholder proposal front, you're seeing more and more calls for public disclosure of EEO-1 data, which is workforce across the entire workforce. This is data that has to be filed with the EEO every year. And the New York City Comptroller sent a letter to 100, or maybe it was 67 S&P 100 companies, and 40 of them said, yes, we'll put it out, and they're engaged with 24 of them, and we can expect stockholder proposals on that. So I think diversity is an area where, one, I think we'll see rulemaking next year or beyond from the SEC on this, but even in advance of that, what we're seeing is that companies are heeding the call that they need to speak about the diversity and inclusion in their certainly in their board of directors and their workforce. And it'll be a topic that people are going to follow on this year and be a lot of focus on. Practice points, don't know. I mean, I definitely think you have to have the aggregate information in. I think that the table where you sort of identify all the directors and what their various characteristics are, I'm not a huge fan of that. Certainly I like the aggregate picture of, particularly on diversity, on racial and gender diversity, rather than sort of individual identity. And then obviously the whole self-identification issue is one that companies have to make sure that their directors are comfortable with the way they're being characterized. So, don't know. Meredith, Alan, any thoughts on D&I?
Yeah, I'll offer a couple of thoughts. First, I agree with you completely that this is more of a market-driven disclosure than an SEC-required disclosure. I think that's true for disclosure of ethnicity and other underrepresented group characteristics of the board of directors. And I think companies do have a range of alternatives to address those issues, whether it's aggregate data or check marks by the boxes of the list of directors. I think of the disclosure, though, on diversity and inclusion as being, with respect to directors, as being somewhat related to the human capital management issue. Again, I think the disclosures are going to be, for companies who are not disclosure minded, it's probably fairly easy to conclude that there isn't any need to make a disclosure, but that isn't going to address not just the concerns of all stakeholders, but the concerns of shareholders in particular. I think the institutional investors have been very vocal and become far more vocal just in the last 2 or 3 months in their statement on stewardship, that they want to see much greater disclosure, not only at the level of the board of directors, but also in the human capital management disclosure that relates to specific characteristics. And the ones that they seem to be focused on most are ethnicity, gender, and race. So I think it's going to be hard for companies to conclude that they can avoid this disclosure forever. So I think companies need to do what they've already been doing, but I think it now needs to be done on a more accelerated basis. Just what are we willing to disclose and how are we going to disclose it?
And I think that it's interesting. So back when proxy disclosure enhancements were done, there was arguably a race to the bottom where everybody decided that they didn't have a policy. And so they didn't have to disclose anything about the board diversity efforts because it was only required if you have a policy. And so at the beginning, there was very little, and this has been private ordering driven. I think that if you don't have pretty robust disclosure, including around the workforce somewhere pretty easily available, you're going to get a shareholder proposal. It's going to ask for the EEO on information. Those are not going to be excludable, as far as I know, unless they missed a deadline or something. And so they get negotiated out by saying, yes, we'll publish the EEO1 report. I think they go on the website, and so you can put them in context. It can be really useful. It can be a good way to put it out there and have your, your message with it. So you talk about how you view diversity inclusion, and then you include the EEO1 report and any other reports you think are meaningful. But this is, consistent with everything else we're talking about here. This is not going away. This is getting more and more important, and resistance is it's really not it's not a way to go right now.
Resistance is futile, Star Trek reference. So Ellen, this year, I think the proxy season is going to see fast-moving COVID disclosures, just like last proxy season, because last year we were all becoming aware of the virus and what its implications were, what its effects were. And now we might have a circumstance where workforce is slowly getting vaccinated, your customer base is slowly getting vaccinated during the proxy season. So what sort of COVID-related disclosure issues do you foresee?
Well, COVID is, while it may seem like we've been in the pandemic and working with COVID forever, it's still a relatively new disclosure topic. Right? Only for 9 months have we had to deal with this as a disclosure topic. And it's had an impact on a number of disclosures. And I suspect you're right that we will see some disclosures in the proxy statement or as part of proxy season that are COVID related, probably related to health and welfare of employees. Getting back to Keith's point about disclosures on a lot of these issues being for stakeholders, but the safety and well-being of the employees. But I think that what we'll also see on COVID disclosures is continued revisiting of the extent to which a company can provide guidance. For those companies that provide guidance, most companies that were providing guidance, back in March and April, when it was totally uncertain as to what the extent and the impact and duration of the virus would be, were withdrawing their guidance or suspending guidance. And we're slowly seeing companies offer more guidance, not always on earnings, but maybe on key performance metrics or revenues or the particular matters on which now, with some months of experience in the pandemic, they feel is reasonably predictable and safe to make a forward-looking disclosure about. I think MD&A will continue to be a challenge. As you said, Brock, this is a rapidly moving issue. The rollout of the vaccine, the potential new strain of the virus, what the impact of those factors will be has still created a lot of uncertainty. So I think that we'll see continued focus on the earnings releases, the MD&A, what non-GAAP financial measures companies are comfortable with that relate to COVID. My only practice tip, if I can offer one on COVID, is take another look at every disclosure that you make as a public company that relates to disclosure, whether it's in your earnings release, whether it's your description of the risk of COVID, whatever impact it has had on your business, and take a fresh look and tailor that disclosure to where the company is now. The SEC's done, and the staff has given a lot of guidance on how to address COVID issues. And the disclosure topic 9, disclosure topic 9A, and the joint statement from Jay Clayton and Bill Henman back in early April offer a lot of good tips on things to think about in focusing your COVID-related disclosures. And the risk of not focusing adequately on your COVID-related disclosures, I think, has been demonstrated by the recent SEC enforcement action against Cheesecake Factory and the piling up of class action lawsuits against companies for failure to make appropriate disclosures about COVID. Where those will go is anybody's guess at this point, but it's a high-risk area still. And so it's an area that companies need to continue to focus on. I guess one place we haven't really seen disclosure and that will probably present a challenge in the upcoming proxy statements will be the extent to which compensation committees take into account the effect of the pandemic on the company's performance under incentive plans. So to what extent will companies explain the impact of COVID in the CD&A and explaining how they made compensation decisions for the named executive officers?
I agree with all that for sure. Those are really key points. I think one point I've been pushing a bit on is to go through last year's risk factors and basically completely refresh them because you now know if those risks that you said were going to happen happened, and now you're dealing with different risks relating to resurgence. Another really key risk that people are going to be dealing with, I've seen some good disclosures about it, is the long-term impact of the pandemic work style and lifestyle. And you know, if you're a company that makes office furniture for office buildings, I mean, you'll have something different to say than somebody who makes things to make home offices work, things like that. So there's long-term issues that are now changed. You're going to need to refresh the risk factors to reflect what's actually going on. And I think that on proxy disclosures, pay adjustments for COVID are showing up. And it's going to be, you know, I bet there'll be a lot of talking going on with institutional investors and others about why those adjustments are appropriate. So I think that'll be a very hot topic this year.
And my only point, which is a fairly obvious one, is that COVID's really no different than any other known trend or uncertainty, other than it is one that is pretty much assuredly hitting every business in some material way. And that's what MD&A is about. That's what companies have had to do with known trends and uncertainties throughout any thing that happens in the life of the company. So I think treat it like a known trend or uncertainty that has happened and that has had an impact on your business, and try to make the best discussion and analysis that you can of that impact.
So in Meredith, we have a new look business section. We've already talked about human capital management, which is a big part of the change to the business section, but there are other changes. What sort of pointers do you have about the other facets of the business section?
Well, I guess this might sound a little bit flip, but I don't really think they changed that much in the business section. Now you can leave out the history of the company. People had already started leaving that out. Companies had already started leaving out various line items that seemed out of date. So those are now legitimized because they've been deleted. I'm not seeing a great rush to include a hyperlink back to an old company history. I don't really think people care that much about the company's history, frankly. You have to talk about what's material in understanding the business. So I think that's not so much. I think the key point here is you want a business description that describes your business, and then you want to take the handy dandy marked copies of SK that we all have created and make sure you're not leaving anything out that you should include. But I don't think that there is a lot of change here. So my practice pointer here is don't expect to have a completely different business description. I'll be curious to hear if others feel differently.
I totally agree, Meredith. I mean, I think that it was a good effort on the SEC's part to go through the rule book and to, try to look at the rules and try to update them to make them reflect current reality. Maybe try to get rid of some of the line items that seem to be a little too prescriptive. On the other hand, I would be shocked if companies found that at the end of the day, they had a hugely different business description than the one they had last year. So
I agree completely with the conclusion you two have reached. I have heard from a compliance standpoint, an interesting point of view from in-house people who say, this requires that we think again about our checklist or our disclosure controls and procedures, because we used to have on our checklist these prescriptive requirements. To what extent are patents material to the company? We know we have to address that. Someone will look at that in a rules check. To what extent are we dependent on a particular customer because 10% of our revenues come from that customer? That will no longer be on the checklist. And so it now becomes a matter of our judgment as to whether it's material. But how do you make sure that each year you're reassessing that point? It's not a major point, but I thought it was an interesting perspective that as we review companies' disclosures as outside advisors or as in-house people are preparing their disclosures, making sure that they're keeping their eye on things that used to be routinely looked at, but now may fall off at the checklist.
Well, it might make sense to include some of those as examples of items that you may want to talk about. I mean, I think that that's I agree that it doesn't work well for when you have your disclosure controls and procedures checklists. When you go principles based, it becomes it's a lot more effort. And it was easier to have a list. So that will be, I think it's going to be a while before those disappear from the thought process on 10Ks.
And one good tip I heard from a panel that I convened on this topic from someone in-house was that if you are in-house and you are proposing to delete a particular disclosure, to have on the draft that you circulate that proposed deletion, because there might be other parts of your business unit that might be relying on that disclosure for other reasons and SEC compliance. And so to make people aware of, hey, we've had this in there forever, and now we're getting rid of it, but you forgot to tell other people that need to know. Keith, what about the legal proceedings section? That's had a refresh as well.
it has had a refresh, but here again, I think there'll probably not be a big change. It depends. The legal proceedings section has always had a little bit of a disclosure tension with the contingencies footnote that is required under GAAP. And some companies, those requirements are slightly different. The contingency disclosure is much more evaluative of the materiality of the potential contingency. The legal proceedings disclosure is much more the who, what, when, and where. You know, where was the case filed? What did it claim? How much did it ask for, et cetera. You can put those together, and many companies have done that. Have all of the information that's required under 103, principally the court where the proceeding was brought, the nature of the claim, the amount requested. Put that into your GAAP disclosure, and then cross-reference it. And again, companies have been doing that for quite a number of years. Many companies think that's really a game not worth the candle. Let the evaluative GAAP disclosure, contingency disclosure sit on its own, and just put in the material legal proceedings in 103. I don't really have a view on it. I'm not sure. I think it really helps all the disclosure all that much, and I'm inclined just to leave things the way that they've been. The few little tweaks that they've made to raising the environmental threshold to 300,000 or such other amount as companies believe is material to their business, that could result in some change. Although, to be honest, I haven't had many clients over at least the past 10, 15 years who've had environmental disclosure. So that's just not something that I've dealt with very much. So I think that the cross-reference could make it easier, could streamline it, but companies might find that it puts more stuff into the footnotes to their financials, and they just assume keep the way that they are. So I don't really expect, I expect companies won't use the occasion of these rule changes to make changes that they otherwise might not have done, because I think you could have done it before.
So I have a bunch of views on this one. This one is a funny one, in a sense, because a lot of companies have been cross-referencing for many years. And many of them do not include the 103 specific disclosure requirements. And if you were to tell these companies to please put the courts and the amounts claimed and all of that stuff into their footnote, they would look at you like you were insane. And I don't know that now that there's a codified version of how to do a cross-reference, that will result in people adding a lot to their legal proceedings footnote. That'll be an interesting conversation that goes on. I mean, I think people have viewed a lot of this, extreme detail as perhaps not, especially material. I was sort of surprised it didn't delete some of it.
Yeah, you're right, Meredith. I thought it was interesting that the commission didn't take the occasion to think, well, gee, do we really need this, information? And
all the stuff about which court and all that. So that's one issue I think that is an interesting one to see whether people actually change how they do it. I will say on the environmental threshold, I've already had 2 companies that are going to be using the higher number. They have government charges that are, say, definitely over 100,000. And I think the way it works, if I recall, is that if it's over 300, you can use the other formulation as long as you include the disclosure. And I know one company I worked with that's going to use that. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It does enable you to avoid additional disclosure about truly immaterial events. Even no matter how you feel about the environment and disclosure about climate change and all that, that isn't really related to this. This is a vestige of a very old congressional mandate that ended up in an odd language in 103. I mean, so you could go on and on about that. The last thing I'm curious whether you all have any views about is I've been asked how this impacts the forward-looking statements to coverage. Because if it's in the footnote, forward-looking just doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to the financial statements. If it's in 103, presumably it does. I don't really think it makes a difference though, because you're going to have to put the forward-looking information in essence in the footnote no matter what, because that's GAAP. And you don't really have to put numbers in 103. You just have to disclose material pending legal proceedings. You don't have
to. How much in complying with 103 really is forward-looking?
So I think this is sort of a perhaps unduly twisted version of worrying. That you can live with any version of this that you like. I don't see this rulemaking as changing what people do. I don't know, but I probably am being a little flip here.
Well, I agree with that, but subject to what you had also said, Meredith, that 2 companies that you're working with are going to utilize the higher threshold, probably the $1 million threshold, as opposed to the 1% of current assets, I think is the alternative.
Right.
I've been surprised looking at the 10Ks that have been filed since the new rules came into effect at how few companies have taken advantage of the higher threshold. Personally, I don't think, especially for larger companies and large cap companies, it is difficult to reach a conclusion that the $1 million threshold still is reasonably designed to assure that any material pending legal proceedings or any material environmental liability will be disclosed. And yet so few have done that. Now, it may be, as Keith said, there aren't that many companies that have to make those disclosures to begin with. And looking at the economic analysis and the adopting release, it looks like not that many public companies end up with a material environmental liability once their actions get resolved. But I'm working with a couple of companies who, because you had to carry forward those disclosures from 10K to 10K, and some of these environmental proceedings and investigations drag on for years and years and years without getting resolved. Not because there are huge problems, it's just that the process moves slowly. And so a company that has a lot of those disclosures, if they can eliminate those that fall between the $300,000 and $1 million potential exposure can really reduce their disclosure. So I'm glad to hear that you know of companies that are doing that, because so few have, and it seems to me to make good sense. I'm aware of the cons that others have raised, that maybe by saying that $1 million is our threshold for materiality, that means in all contexts, we consider a $1 million liability to be material. Yet, I don't find that argument compelling, but there are those who have that concern. So I hope you're helping dispel that.
I'm trying to. I think that other concerns are that anyone who uses the alternative threshold might get called out by stakeholders who believe that all environmental, that reducing this number was not a good idea, and that letting companies make these judgments is not a good idea. And so you have to, it's a careful thought process. But for companies that have, $700,000 matters, that are multi-billion-dollar earnings companies, it's pretty ridiculous disclosure. It doesn't add to the total mix of anything other than detail in a filing. So it's worth thinking about it in those settings.
The question will be how many instances will there be where it's less than $1 million but more than 300,000?
I've got some. Believe it or not, I have some. So that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
So risk factors, always one of my favorite sections. This is what corporate lawyers are paid to do, wearing our compliance hat, to be a little paranoid, to have some CYA disclosure. But we have a new look risk factor section. Alan, what are your pointers in that area?
Yeah, well, my main pointer is the one that we've all made already, and that is it's a good time to go back and take a fresh look at your risk factors, particularly your COVID risk factor. But I think there's an additional reason now for companies to revisit their risk factors, and that's because of the new rules, which the SEC was clear in the adopting release about, is that the commission view is that risk factor disclosures are, in many cases, too wordy, too long, and that too many of the risk factors are generic or general risk factors. They're not risk factors that are unique or tailored to the company's particular circumstance. Those are so-called generic risk factors in the SEC's release. Things like an investment in our stock, there's no guarantee of a return. The stock market may go down. Past results are not necessarily indicative of future performance. Those sorts of things that are true, and many other examples that are not necessarily helpful to an investor in making a decision about the particular company. I understand the reasons why some companies like to include those disclosures, but I think it's a good time to look back at them, because the SEC's new rules require that companies divide their risk factors, which already carry subcaptions over them to be descriptive of the risk factor that's disclosed, to divide them into categories, try to group them under common headings, and then have a separate section for generic risk factors, which will come after the more significant tailored risk factors. And once the company has labeled a risk factor as a generic risk factor, if the two sections combined exceed 15 pages, then the company has to include a bullet or numbered section that summarizes the most significant or the most material risk factors that the company has, and include that summary, which can't exceed 2 pages, in the forepart of the document, whether it's the 10K or a registration statement. And so it's going to add more pages in the form of a summary if the company has a risk factor section that exceeds 15 pages. So I think it's a clear, not directive, but a suggestion from the SEC that it would be good to take a look at your risk factors, see if you can reduce the wordiness of them, make them more specific to the company's particular situation, eliminate generic risk factors, and get below 15 pages if you can.
Yeah, this issue, it's such a, well, I was going to say it's such a losing issue. I mean, it's every litigator in your law firm that you talk to will say, of course you should have all these risk factors. You'd be crazy to take them to take them out. My sense, at least in talking to clients, was that if you were at 16 or 17 pages of risk factors, yeah, maybe you might try to trim it down. But anything above that, put in the summary. The real question is the summary going to be the kind of summary that we're expected that we've become used to seeing in IPOs, when in the box at the beginning of the prospectus, there's a risk factor section where you got about a half a page of risk factors. Is it going to be that level of it or something more? Meredith, Alan, what do you think?
I've seen pretty many versions of the summary that are basically taking the forward-looking statements bullet list and calling that your risk factor summary. Jazz it up a little bit, and that way you don't have two. That there's a, I can't remember, maybe it's an internal survey we have that shows a lot of companies doing that. My understanding is that, at least from what we're saying, if you're, similar to what you said, Keith, if you're close to 15, try to stay under 15. If you're over 15, nobody's trying at all.
Right.
Like a lot of the life sciences companies will have 30 or 40 pages. It would be absurd to attempt to bring that down below 15. I also think that you know, somebody would have said we might suffer from a pandemic 2 years ago, would have been a generic risk factor.
Right.
You know, pick your generic topic at any time. We've been encouraging, certainly label them general, not generic, general risk factors. And if you can tailor them a bit to your company, it's hard to argue unless you're trying to you're really close to 15 pages. It's hard to argue that you should shorten them by getting rid of risk factors, frankly.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to do with risk factors is to look really hard at where you're saying this may have an impact, right, this could have an impact, et cetera. That is, I think, the biggest area where there could be real liability, not only from the SEC, but more importantly from private plaintiffs who
yeah,
use that as an
push on a lot. I mean, we all push on the hypothetical risk factors, but it's a real issue.
Oh,
you say you may have this problem and you already have this problem, you just have a misstatement. And the SEC, those are like lay down cases for the SEC. They keep bringing them and bringing them.
Yeah.
So there's an easy way to handle it. You know, we have in the past and we may in the future.
Right.
But there are a lot of different ways you can do it. And it's not wise to, it's essentially basic, you know, good disclosure hygiene to check them to see if the things are going on.
Yeah, and I quite frankly,
most companies do from year to year, and I wonder how many companies who are currently over 15 pages will actually fall back below 15 pages. As you both said, I think if you're at 16 pages, maybe it's a good time to think about trying to scale it back just to save 2 pages in your summary. But the SEC's release said that 40% of companies, you know, are over 15 pages and would have to include this 2-page summary. So that's a significant percentage of the public company community that's already somewhere over 15, and I have to believe that many of them are well over 15 pages. So we may see more summaries, but we probably are not likely to see a lot more risk factor sections that fall below 15 pages.
And the headings add pages. You have to add all these headings.
Change the font, maybe?
right.
No, is there a font test?
Yeah.
Margins.
The other thing, sort of not related to this rulemaking, but we've always encouraged our clients every year to make changes to the risk factors, not just for the sake of making changes, but we think having a record that you went through it, you thought about it, and you made changes whenever you're litigating, as opposed to, oh yeah, Your Honor, they had this same risk factor, boilerplate risk factor in year after year after year after year. No, we changed it. We changed it to fit the circumstances of our company. And so I think that's an exercise worth doing.
When I'm at a conference talking to someone who's been in-house, you know, a dozen or more years, I often ask, Have you ever deleted a risk factor and they looked at me like it was shocked, like, is this a trick question? And some of them say
Y2K.
we've reduced it and combined it with another risk factor, but almost all of them say we've actually never deleted a risk factor. So Alan, the SEC's been really busy. Chair Clayton and Bill Hinman, before they left town, really got out a lot of rulemakings. And one of the last ones they did was an enhanced or a changed MD&A, which doesn't take effect for another year, but companies can get ahead of that and start thinking about changes now. What are your pointers in this area?
Well, my first pointer would be that even though the new MD&A requirements won't become mandatory for calendar year companies until the 10K for 2021 that's filed in 2022, is to do as you just suggested. Good to get ahead of the curve. Maybe not necessarily adopt or do early adoption, but at least start thinking about the new presentation format for the MD&A. I mean, it was a long release, is a long release. My take on the release is, and the changes to the rule, is that it's a reorganization of the rule. There's been a lot of movement of instructions or prior guidance from both the staff and the SEC into the rule, but the substantive changes are not huge. There's a greater focus, I think, on mainly a continuation of what I think has been the SEC's push for years, more focus on analysis and less on comparison of results from quarter to quarter, and additional reinforcement of the value of MD&A is its ability to help investors understand what the future looks like and not so much what the past looks like. And so there was an emphasis, particularly in the adopting release itself, on trying to be more forward-looking. So there are changes. Some of the prescriptive requirements have been removed. I think the off-balance sheets table, the contractual obligations table are no longer required. To the extent that the company considers those to be material, they can be discussed in the liquidity and capital resources section. Companies will have the ability to choose, when comparing quarter to quarter, to compare the current quarter to the most recent prior quarter, if that's more indicative of the company's business than comparing the quarter to the same quarter of the prior fiscal year. So there will be some additional flexibility. But in terms of drafting this year's MD&A, my practice tip would be the one that we discussed in connection with one of the other topics. I think, as Keith said, COVID, having had the impact that it's had, is, well, it is a different material trend and uncertainty than any of the companies have had to deal with in the past. Still a material trend and uncertainty, and it's a fast-moving area. And so companies need to be focused, I think, in particular in their MD&A on what they see in the future in connection with the impact of the pandemic on their business.
Well, my 2 cents, I think actually the changes were not insignificant. I don't know that it's going to be revolutionary, but things like getting rid of the selected table, getting rid of the 8 quarters table, unless you've had a material restatement or whatever I forget what the standard is, unless your numbers have changed during those quarters that you've already reported, getting rid of the contractual obligations table. I don't think the off-balance sheet disclosure is any big deal because people already had that, were cross-referencing to it if they had that disclosure in their notes to the financial statements. So the real question I have is, why wouldn't you want to early adopt and not wait for the mandatory compliance? Why wouldn't you want to get rid of the selected table, get rid of the supplementary data, get rid of the contractual obligations table? It seemed to me the only downside is that the disclosure around critical accounting estimates is actually a little more prescriptive and potentially commentable than under the current guidance that exists on critical accounting estimates. And the risk in critical accounting estimates, I think, is that the commission seems to be wanting you to put in some sort of sensitivity analysis around your critical accounting estimates. And companies don't really want to do that. And so
But Harvey called for that way back when,
right,
and nobody ever really did it.
right, exactly.
And then when people said, yeah, we're codifying the critical accounting estimates, I thought, not really, because it's never been a rule.
Right.
And a few companies include a nice sensitivity analysis, say around pension liabilities, or, you know, you see some of it. I think that's a big change. The other thing I would say about why not do it is companies have so much to deal with, and they got their disclosure controls and procedures set up for what it is now. And so, you know, revamping MD&A on top of everything else, and then making sure that anything material is covered somewhere anyway is a lot to do. The other kind of historical fun note for me is a number of these things that they've now deleted were mandated.
Right. Well, off balance sheet, certainly.
You know, by Sarbanes. And so it's fascinating that they've decided, you know, we don't have to have those, even if Sarbanes actually said you have to have those. You know, having had to do a lot of Dodd-Frank rulemaking, I'll be curious to see how much of that gets deleted, you know, 15 years out, you know, it's no longer needed. It was interesting to me that they were allowed, they decided they could do that. I applaud them for having the courage to delete mandatory requirements.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your time and wisdom. As always, everyone is going to be watching this video, I am sure. So Meredith, Keith, and Alan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this Vid-Guide is one of many for a proxy season spectacular conference. All the Vid-Guides are freely accessible. We have one on human capital management disclosures, one on D&I disclosures, one on COVID-related disclosures, business section, legal proceedings, risk factors, and many more, all together in the proxy season part of the Zippy Point website. There are over 125 videos related to the proxy season, but we also have videos regarding E&S, corporate governance, the 34 Act, the 33 Act and deals, career advice, and my favorite, fun party. And if you have any questions, let me know.